Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Last session of the day. Hope you're still fighting fit. This is another interactive session with, as you can see, a slight change to the advertised programme, as they say on the BBC, which I shall come to you in a second. Just to contextualise this session, I once got into a friendly argument with Don Taylor. We were discussing future sort of conference programmes, and he wanted to do something on future trends. And I said, sorry, you can't have a future trend. You can have a trend which you know is a trend because you've got data from behind and you know what it is now, so you can definitely see a trend, and you can speculate as to where it goes in the future, as long as it stays on a sort of a expected. But you can't predict a future trend because, anyway, we haggled and finally said, all right then, let's agree to disagree. Let's say you can have a future trend. If only we could have that prescience, that we could actually look into the future and say, well, that's what's going to happen. And what a difference that would make. Nobody would need investment managers. We'd always be ready for everything, which would be absolutely marvellous. If we could buy a crystal ball on eBay, but alas, we can't do that, and therefore the future is always a mystery. But we lucky few, have instead Mark Beattie, who's come along to tell us just what is going to happen soon, and we're all going to be able to discuss it together. He's standing in for Professor Chris Bones, who was unfortunately unable to make it at the last moment. So please welcome Mark Beattie.
Good afternoon. Okay, I know it's slightly pantomime season, but let's try again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And how are we all today? Good conference so far? Okay, high expectations are going to go downhill from here. Starting off with, as you may have noticed, change to our advertised programme, as Vaughan has said, no Chris Bones, so he sends his apologies. And when Chris found out about 10 days ago that he wasn't going to be able to attend, Chris, as Professor of Leadership and Creativity at Manchester Business School, thought, I'm going to have to find somebody else who can stand here. I need someone with charisma, with the ability to stand and command a room, someone with a deep understanding of learning and technology, and learning and development as well. Well, he couldn't find anybody, so in lieu of that, he called on me, and I'm standing in instead. So I'm going to get my excuses in early, as you can tell. I'm not going to speak for 45 minutes of excuses and then take some questions, but just to set the scene, as it were, I didn't devise this research. It wasn't my idea in the first place. I didn't design it. I didn't conduct it. I didn't analyse it, write the slides, or write the notes. So in a way, I'm kind of working out what I'm doing here, other than sort of hopefully trying to bluff my way through and hope nobody asks me too many awkward questions. Because of that, I need your help. So I hope we're going to have a contract between myself and yourself, the audience, today. Because we're talking about, as Vaughan said, some trends. There's been some research that's been conducted. I'm going to be sharing the results of that with you. And there's going to be questions. I certainly hope there's going to be questions. And to be quite frank, the knowledge, the skills, and the experience of how to answer those questions lies in the seats in front of me. It certainly doesn't lie up here. I'm more than happy to take questions. But what I'm hoping in terms of our contract together is that as those questions arise, A, please shout loudly because the acoustics aren't great in this room if you're not mic'd. I'm hoping the responses to some of these questions, some of the answers, can also come from the room. So just to recap, I would really, really appreciate it if this can be as interactive as possible. Do ask questions all the way through, very much encouraged. Anything doesn't make sense, stick your hand up. And I'd also be calling on people in the audience to contribute as well. Is that okay? So nodding. So you're thinking, well, okay, if I'm not Chris Bones, and I'm not a learning and development expert, and I am an academic, clearly my favourite topic and the thing I'm probably most comfortable talking about to begin with is myself. So I'm going to start with that just for a little bit. So to give you some kind of grounding, I guess, on my perspective, what route I would take. I'm a creativity specialist, a creativity researcher at Manchester Business School, and also joint chairman of the Psychometrics at Work Research Group. So I have kind of some understanding of the learning and development sphere, and also some understanding of digital as well in terms of learning and development by developing psychometric tools that are delivered online. I've also used, probably not very effectively, different types of webinar type systems for teaching undergraduates, masters and MBA students, and have an interest in L&D in general, but sort of with those excuses in mind, as not an L&D expert nor an expert in digital, I very much appreciate your kind of comments, and I'm going to move on now, if that's all right, to start talking about the survey. So are we okay if I move on? Good. Clicker. Right. So our very first look. The other thing I probably should say at the moment, as no one is now listening to me because you're all reading what's on the screen, I know how this works, is to help me, Chris Bones, has made these quite text-heavy. So rather than just having very single-word bullet points that would leave me rather flummoxed, he's put quite a lot of text in. As a result, how I'm supposed to avoid death by PowerPoint, I don't entirely know, because the tendency is then to read what's written in front. The other thing is I can probably say anything I like for the first 30 seconds, because none of you are listening to me, and you're all reading what it says on over there. So this is about the survey itself. Well, for thinking about learning and development in the digital age, at least the survey itself was delivered online, via on the web. And then there was some follow-up interviews with respondents as well. I'll talk about the participants in a moment. We are talking hot off the press here, Q4 2011. And as it says here, literally these are the very first strokes, the very first set of information we've got from the data. And there's a lot more to follow. So the full and summary report and analysis will be available at the end of February. I only got the presentation up 5 days ago, so it's still pretty fresh for me as well. I should also say a little something about where the research has come from. Manchester Business School, in association with the working manager, have come together in order to put together this survey. So any questions or any comments on our participants or about the survey? Didn't think so.
Sorry, is that the results of that survey going to be made available to the Learning and Skills Group, for instance? Or how is it going to be made available?
Okay. They were immediately finding the limits of my expertise and knowledge in this area. I don't, probably, yes, almost certainly, I'm sure. Certainly in one format or another, we'll be looking at sharing these results. Obviously, as an academic institution at Manchester Business School, we're looking to try and transfer our knowledge. So in one way or another, the results will definitely be made available. Exactly what they will look like, I'm going to duck that question and move back to my notes. Right, where are we? So about the participants, who's in it? Well, mainly senior learning people, so you're all reading over my shoulder now. Mainly senior heads of learning, trainings, directors of departments and so on. Almost the vast majority of them had responsibility for learning and development, some with slightly wider remits than that as well. And we're talking about 72 sets of responses of these senior people involved in L&D. And what I find rather encouraging is that our response rate for the questions is around about 90%. So what you're finding is that we are getting the whole gamut of responses, not just the few who could be bothered to go through the rest of the survey. That one? Hang on. About the organisations. They're all basically rather large, the organisations we've been talking to. So given our scope and our generalisability of these results, it's predominantly looking at large organisations based in the UK. And you can probably read what it says on the slide faster than I can say it. So you can see where they've come from. So mainly from the private sector, also some people from the public sector, and also some in the third sector as well. Any questions or comments? Oh, good. Right, so where are we? This is the what did we find stage. So what was the state of the vocation, as Chris has quite put it. So first of all, what's going on in terms of predicted budgets. So we see what happened over the last few years. We've got those that were unsure of their budgetary changes, those that were expecting more budgets, down and the same. And I think the main things to be looking at, not many people in terms of this blue quadrant on the right-hand side, or blue section on the right-hand side, not many people anticipating a rise in their budgets. But quite importantly, I guess at the same time, not so many people expecting their budgets to go down in comparison with the last 2 years. And a reasonable amount of stability. I've got my notes here. The main thing we're looking at here seems to be some degree of budgetary stability. Throwing that out to the room, how does that fit, or how does that stand with the kind of experiences that people have had in the room over, say, the last 6 months or so?
Budgetary stability actually means, in effect, about a 5% fall in R&D budgets next year.
For some. Okay.
I think there's a bigger, for my clients, I think there's a big theme about stability. I think a lot of my clients are saying that they had a shock at the end of 2008 about Lehman. They didn't really understand what that meant. deal with it, cost cutting and things. 2011 they started to get used to it. 2012, 2013, 2014, they think that what's happened is they've come down and now they're along there. So I think there's stability not just on this budgetary side, but I think there's a stability of feeling that they understand that we've had a really awful time and it's not going to get better anytime soon, but it's not going to get dramatically worse anytime soon. So I think there's stability out there. It's certainly a conversation that a lot of my clients, and that's in the private sector like law firms, shipping firms, professional services firms, are all saying the same sort of thing.
Can I just double check or just get a sense check? Can people hear that comment? Did most people manage to pick up on that? Yeah. Okay, so general sense being that there is some stability after a lot of shock. People, I guess, are plateauing, as it were, but not plateauing necessarily at a high level, plateauing probably towards the bottom. Any other questions or comments? Small is beautiful, it says. This is data available for those people who had a precise L&D team with a sort of a structure around it. So as I said here, roughly 50% of respondents had a centralised team, and 90% represent companies of over 500 employees or more. You're looking at the terms of the size of L&D departments, the vast majority, it says here, tend to be relatively small, 62%, and only a few larger, more than 51. Again, any comments, any thoughts? Does this fit with what people's expectations are of their previous experiences?
Would be interesting to see where you said 50% of the respondents had a centralised L&D team, whether that is L&D in its own right, or whether it's L&D as part of a HR team.
Interesting. I'm not, from the data I've seen, I can't answer that question, but the role of L&D within HR, either within, outside, closely aligned, is not something we can tell from the data, but I'm sure that is an interesting issue.
It is interesting because it's, I mean, I'm quite loud in the fact that L&D should not be part of HR. It's a supportive function, but L&D is a professional in its own right. And a lot of the people that I deal with, their L&D teams are sat within HR, so they're quite influenced by the HR spend, and the L&D spend comes out of that. So perhaps you might want to relay back to Chris for next year to see if you can split that down.
And indeed, again, all Chris was able to do in the time available from the data coming around was to do the first line, first look at. It may well be that there's more data hidden away there. Certainly within some of the qualitative interview questions, there may well be some more information there.
Survey, and I was quite disappointed to see that in there, because it's quite a trend.
Duly noted. So for next year, main thing to be looking at is the role within or without within HR and L&D. Any other comments? Questions? Okay. So on to the budgets themselves. My eyes immediately were drawn to the orange section. So more than 25% of L&D departments didn't know what their budgets were, and therefore my understanding is in terms of where the data was treated, after that, when people were asked about specific things about the budgets, those didn't know what their budgets were, their results were discounted. So what we're saying in terms of that line through the middle is around about 50% or so have got budgets of more than £250,000 to spend. And if we're looking at the size of the team, it would seem from the previous slides that there's not that many people in the team and a reasonably large amount of money to go around. So I guess it's then looking at what is done with that budget and what comes out, the results are of employing that budget. And actually one of the trends we're seeing is sometimes a lack of evidence of return on investment or a lack of strategy about how that money is spent and how that budget is allocated. Again, any observations or questions on this slide? Does it seem strange to you that over 25% of the people surveyed, and they were senior, didn't know what their L&D budgets were? So I'm nodding. I'm wondering, why, I don't know the answer, so I'm going to throw this out there. Why do you think that is the case? Why do over 25% of the survey respondents not know what their budgets were?
A senior trainer or someone wouldn't necessarily know what the overall budget of the department was. I wouldn't necessarily expect them to know that.
Okay, so it could be in terms of who we were asking. Lady down here.
I was just thinking back to this lady's point about the fact that L&D or learning and training functions and parts, within businesses that call themselves training or learning are hidden within other bigger budgets. Yeah. And often it's, put together your what would you like for next year, and if you get it, you'll be lucky, and then,
brought in with projects as well.
Yeah.
So you'll be given a budget for a project that's an operational budget, and then they'll say, oh, X% will be for training or for L&D, but it doesn't come under a specific L&D budget, it comes under a project, so that's why we're getting that type of result.
Also, because of cost pressures coming in, people are becoming myopic by the day. So they're looking at, like I said, one bigger project or one, so they will look at a training project and see if that makes sense and then allocate budget. So that's getting centrally controlled more and more, and it, slowly lifting the reins as it comes across. So therefore, sometimes they purposely not giving the view of the budget as well.
So you're to argue there's sometimes a tendency towards an ad hoc budget allocation process rather than maybe being more strategic at how that budget is spent.
They want to hold it closely.
Anyone else echo that or see similar kinds of trends out there? Lady at the back. So I thought the first it was lack of centralisation. I didn't quite catch the second comment, I'm sorry. Lack of cost focus. That almost seems slightly in opposition to what you were saying. So some people say there's more of a cost focus, some will say less.
I think there's a strong cost focus, but I'm not sure that people are always acutely aware of where the spend is and how that's managed. It also makes me wonder the reliability of the other figures, because I think people who've said this is what the budget is, they might be expressing the central training budget, whereas in fact a lot of the expenditure in time, money and effort is devolved or distributed amongst the organisation. So people may just not quite know the full picture.
Okay. But I guess without that with a lack of full picture, it might be quite difficult to do appropriate planning. There's a lady down there and a gentleman here.
Yeah, I just also wanted, thinking about data, and again, it could be something for another time, is just to say, if there is a budget for organisations who do know what they're spending, it would be nice to see per head of the employee how much, because otherwise 250,000 could be one small company, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
For a large company, it's like, well, we're not going to get much for that. Sorry.
At the risk of asking you to sprint to the back of the room, there was a hand up at the back, wasn't there? I don't think. Where's the hand? I saw a hand. Sorry. That's me. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's some organisations as well, they're working in such a way that they're looking at the profits they're making or look at where they are within the organisation at any given point in time. So you might get 3-monthly or quarterly, should say, reviews, and at that point then they come back to the L&D department and say, well, okay, we know you wanted that, but this is what you're going to get because this is what you can afford to give you right now. So you couldn't really say for the whole year what the budget was because it just keeps changing almost quarterly, if you like.
Right. Thank you. So if it's okay with everyone else, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Is that okay? Oh, go on, we have another comment.
I think Denise is right about structures of organisations, because one thing nobody's mentioned are the bean counters, or what I call the bean counters. Sometimes you never know what the budget is, because you'll get to this point in the year, and all of a sudden somebody will say, oh, there's so much more money now in the budget because we're underspent at this time of the year, we need to spend it by year end. So sometimes you are in that position where you don't actually know what the bottom line is because the bean count hasn't told you. And it comes down to the structure of the organisation.
Sure, and that I'm assuming must lead to great levels of uncertainty, difficulty in forward planning, forward thinking, and being strategic about what L&D interventions you're going to use at what point to achieve what. So with that, it's okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So where does the money go, it says. I've got 3 questions. You can read the top statement. The company's larger than 1,000 employees. A quarter L&D teams are 5 or fewer, etc. So question to the audience. Does too much money leave the business? We've got some slides on this in a moment. Any thoughts on that? Actually, before I ask that, how many people here would see themselves as a L&D provider?
Depends what you mean by provider.
I guess an external consultancy training organisation who perhaps sells services into another company, provides services to another company. Sorry, sell a horrible word. Who would see themselves as the procurer, as it were? But I guess your take on this is going to differ depending on whether you're providing or buying the services. But that first question, does too much money leave the business? I guess we're talking about outsourcing here. Any thoughts?
Some
sometimes using an external provider can actually...
I'm sorry.
Sometimes using an external provider can actually be a cheaper option.
Mm-hmm.
It means you don't have to train up a member of your staff with specialist knowledge. But with simple skills, sometimes it is an expensive option to provide.
Okay.
And I'd reinforce that. I think the issue isn't about, there isn't a right amount of money to leave or stay within. It's about whether you get the best value. But it certainly looks like the figures are supporting the trend is less internal resource and more is being bought in.
Okay. Anyone else like to add to that or comment? There's a lady at the back.
Hi, I definitely think a lot of is spent external more than should be, and I think the problem with doing that is how business relevant it is. So the joy of having internal resource is that it's quite often seen as more business relevant.
Down here.
I completely agree with that. We're sort of making a shift from external to internal, and I think part of it is about time. The choice to go external is often, it looks like a quicker way of getting to what you want for the same or less money, where actually the impact on the business is often limited, where really you need to just be honest with yourself about how long it really takes to achieve what it is that you're trying to do.
So you say your trend is more towards insourcing or internalising the provision?
Yes, we had a very strict kind of split between what we could spend on delivery of content or delivery of learning and what we could spend on staff costs. And so that limited what we could do, and so we kind of had to choose to go external because we couldn't employ any more people, but actually it completely limited what we were able to do, and that you end up, it doesn't save you any time because you just end up managing your suppliers rather than actually just delivering the learning.
Okay. I think now it seems a good time, an opportune time to move on to the next set of slides as they, sorry, I've just cut you off in the middle, go on.
That's fine. It's back on. So I think, we were discussing, I'm not sure what the context of this is, and the reason we're saying that is, there's no such thing as leaving the business. I guess it's about the value what you create for your money you have to spend, internally or externally. I guess it's the value which you get out of it, and I think the solution really is how you strategically partner with the right people who can give you the right value, whether it's in-house, whether it's outside. So I'm not really sure where even the question is coming from. So.
Sure. Well, I think one of the reasons it's there, in my understanding, is when we're looking at some of the rest of the data, is that there doesn't appear to be that much evidence of demonstrating the return on investment, demonstrating the alignment of the L&D activities to strategic imperatives. So I think that's probably the main, and we'll look a little bit at that in a moment. But if it's okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which effectively asks us, what are really the average duties of people in L&D? And I'm sure many people are going, average duties, no such thing exists, and that's pretty much, I think, the result of the finding. There doesn't appear to be an average set of duties. And at the moment, the next slide is starting to focus on what's basically outsourced versus undertaken internally. And in these cases, we've got the blue boxes there, and the one that's been cut off slightly, he said, is supposed to say learning, strategy, development, and management on that far left-hand side. So in terms of undertaken, it would see that the strategy stays very much in-house. And in comparison, the administration, or also similarly, administration seems very much in-house. Now, one of the notes that Chris made on the slides I found rather interesting. This seems somewhat antithetical to pretty much any other function's take on administration. Now, I wouldn't ever want to classify myself as a business expert, but my understanding is often many administrative roles, functions, and tasks and processes, because of their administrative nature and relatively rote nature, are often outsourced because they can be quite quickly picked up by somebody else and done efficiently. Chris's notes were, this seems to be the absolute opposite when it comes to L&D. Now that was his take on it, and I seem to agree. I think that seems quite strange. Often outsourcing administration is rather popular. So any thoughts, any comments on that?
I think it's, sorry.
It's going to get you fit, this, isn't it?
So it logically makes sense to your point. I think why you would see a lot of, administration being in-house is because probably of the nature of it. If you look at administration of it, what you can do is you can, block calendars, put it on the LMS, all of that can be outsourced. But when it comes to actual delivery of training, especially classroom training, that's where you need a person to be there, work with, booking of rooms, etc. And maybe that's why you see a maybe higher percentage of doing it internally. At least that portion of it which require physical presence.
One of the things that made me think, and I thought the data doesn't necessarily prove or disprove this, is that if the teams are small and they're taking lots of administration work on, that would seem to suggest there's less and less time, manpower, man-hours available, person-hours available to spend on the strategy, the design, and more strategic issues.
That's why you have an administrator.
Okay.
They do the work for you.
Any other comments or any thoughts on that? Lady down here.
It might be explained by, for example, what we have in the Environment Agency is an internal HR service centre that also provides learning admin. So,
okay.
It's lies and statistics, isn't it? You can't necessarily tell from that.
There's always a limit. But so hopefully for me, the numbers are always there to provoke debate and to start thinking about things, not necessarily answer the question unequivocally. Okay, any other observations on these? I'm going to talk a little bit about these. So the next slide, I think, starts to try and explain this. I said it's rather text heavy here. Thank you, Chris, for the effort, but I'll give you just a moment to read this rather than just reading it out. I think the main take-home point, I think these are things we've already discussed or issues that have already been raised, is that everyone sees that strategy is vital, it's important, it needs to be retained within. However, as I said in the second bullet point, there seems to be a missing link tying together what activities there are and what L&D activities are undertaken, and then the link to strategy. And when asked in the interviews, try and come up with examples, and I haven't seen these specifically, but many examples provided were operational rather than strategic. So with that being the case, it sounds relatively damning, doesn't it, really? Is that there's not really that much. We're spending money, we're doing things, we're using our team, but we're not proving or not showing the relationship between the things we do and how they align with strategy. That seems relatively provocative. Anyone like to take a counterpoint to that? Perhaps even more worrying is that no one wants to. Okay, this gentleman here. Go on.
I wonder just how much of an artificial divide there is between operational and strategic, because surely the very purpose of operations is to deliver the strategic outcomes for the organisation. So if the organisation want to achieve X, Y, and Z, then the business is set up to do that, and then learning supports those operations. And a lot of learning is what individuals do to be able to do their job more effectively. If they do it more effectively, the business succeeds, it achieves its strategic purpose. I think it's sometimes easy, it's often very hard to get a direct line connection between the actual things that you're delivering and the final strategic outcome. But as long as you've got a reasonable line of sight, as long as you are confident that you have that form of connection, I don't see there being a problem between focusing on operations and still being strategically aligned.
Anyone else? No? Okay. I guess the last bit, specifically tying into our theme for today, is little evidences of a strategic purpose for why we're using technology in learning and development. And there's some slides towards the end that start to address some of those issues. One of the other slides here is looking at how closely involved people are in terms of the activities undertaken versus outsourced, and how the content design of learning and design initiatives seems to be somewhat undertaken, but a large slice being provided in terms of outsourcing. Slides that then explain that content design and development. And Chris's points here is that as we start to lose control of the design, how can you ensure that the delivery, or the design and delivery, is aligned with strategic objectives? That as we start to outsource and ask expert people in to get involved in both design and delivery, that the biases of that expert can start to sway. Maybe they have their own specific models, their own specific ways of looking at things that might not necessarily be aligned. And the thing that I found rather interesting, certainly at the bottom, is how we're moving towards a state where people in L&D are being increasingly looked at in terms of quality control or quality assurance. If we are spending money on the example here's on coaching, for example, what mechanisms, what metrics are in place to see whether these are effective or not? So we might be arguing that there's a need for internal expertise on judging, monitoring, evaluating different types of learning and development initiative and seeing their efficacy, which is moving very much towards, I guess in many cases, it might be statistical analyses, different forms of analyses of performance and so on. And the question I've got here is, are there the appropriate skills within the L&D function for performing those duties? As a first question, are L&D people, and it's a very broad generalisation, but if this is the way the field is going, people are increasingly being looked at to evaluate the effectiveness of other people's interventions. Are the skills there to do that? Any thoughts?
The lady at the back there, right at the very back.
Thank you.
I think there are the skills to do the measurement. I think the problem is that when the design and possibly the delivery are outsourced, it's very difficult when you come to the measurement piece to understand what was in the TNA, the needs analysis piece, and therefore what you should be measuring, so what the right measurement is. So I think the skill levels are there. Certainly within our organisation, that is my job, is to measure the effectiveness and quality assurance of any learning intervention. But the problem is that when you don't have the needs analysis in-house or documented in-house, it's very difficult to do the measurement afterwards.
Right. That, and I guess also in terms of selection of the appropriate metric.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I just double check at the back? Does this mean I've got 15 minutes left? It's just gone funny. I think it's gone slightly haywire. My
Nearly half an hour.
traffic light system's gone completely wrong. Anyway, so where we are. Next section. So what's happening? What's happening to L&D teams themselves, as it were? So what the notes I've got here is suggesting that learning and development people are often perceived as the catalyst for change. They make things happen, changing culture, changing behaviours, changing skills in order to transform the business. But what's happening to the changes themselves? So, common phrase we seemingly hear all the time, doing more with less seems to be a common phrase. 2/3 people believe that they're delivering more over the last 12 months, despite the vast majority of them either having budgets that stay the same or decreasing. Many of them going through restructuring. It seems a common theme that keeps coming up again and again is restructuring of the L&D team. And I've heard people mentioning centralisation earlier, and that again is one of the themes that comes through in the data here. And the risk of repeating something on a slide earlier, an L&D manager who was interviewed for this survey, an L&D manager for a university, said, well, it's changed 6 times in 4 years in terms of the structure of the L&D team, in terms of how the impact that must have in terms of strategy, design and delivery. Maybe there's more of a tendency to start to outsource more activities because at least those things are probably going to stay relatively the same. Anyone add to that or disagree with that as an interpretation?
The manager that actually said that they changed their L&D team 3 or 4 times in as many years, was that to reflect change in the business, or was that just to mould the team because they didn't have what they wanted at that time? I think especially with my team, we are in continual change of flux, but that's because we change, because the business changes.
Yes.
And unless we change with the business, we can't support the business. So it'd be interesting to find out, yes, there was an interview done there, but the question would have been, have you changed because the business has changed, or are you just changing because you haven't quite got the right team yet?
That was one of the questions I asked. So the question here was, does the L&D team keep changing to mirror or reflect the changes that are happening in the larger business? That was one of the questions I asked Sam specifically about this, because I was interested in that as well. And we can't be 100% sure in terms of that one quotation I just used, but that did seem to be the general trend that was coming through from the qualitative interviews, was a constant change and upheaval within the business, therefore being reflected in changes in the L&D team. Any other questions or comments?
I would say it's 7 structures in 7 years and why?
7 in 7. Anyone advance on 7 on 7? Sorry, did I miss a hand? It was down. Okay. So in terms of then asking some qualitative information and getting some responses back for those people who say, well, we've got less money, our budgets are decreasing, what's happening? And I think we're talking about centralisation was mentioned earlier. So I'll just give you a moment just to have a look at these quotations that seem to see some of the major trends that are happening in organisations with decreasing budgets. And the trend actually looks remarkably similar when we look at the organisations and those who have increasing budgets. Which might push one to assume that actually changes in budgets make no difference. What's actually happening is a trend, as it were, a future trend, towards centralisation, regardless of whether budgets are increasing or decreasing. Any comment? Centralisation here to stay? Is this what we can expect over the coming years?
Well, it used to be centralised, and then it became decentralised, then it went into business, then it went out of business, then it's gone back into being centralised. You know, I've been in the business long enough to know that something else is going to come around that we did 10 years ago.
So you would argue that it's waves and cycles, fads and fashions, as it were.
And I contest that a little too, if I may. Not over you. In that the old model of training courses has gone through that, you know, whether it's centrally organised or decentral. But a lot of the conversations we've had over these couple of days is about the growth of informal learning and how people, you know, the learning that's happening organically within the workplace, that now it is both centralised and decentralised at the same time. And I think the real art of the blend is to find ways to not say central or decentralised is good, but how the two can work together most effectively.
And I guess formal versus informal approaches.
Same issue, not identical phrasing, but same issue, I think, yeah.
Okay, anyone else like to add to that? Okay, harking back to what we said, there's fads and fashions. I'm reading a paper about management fads and fashions in general, and basic analysis of journal articles, magazine articles in the trade press about different initiatives, fads and fashions. I think it went back to the 1960s. And what they were arguing is there's always been fads and fashions, but what the data seem to suggest is that the cycles are getting ever faster. So we're into a specific fad or fashion where once upon a time it might have lasted for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Now a fashion or a fad starts, it's grasped, played with for a bit and dropped much faster to move on to the next fad and fashion. Would that seem to echo other people's experiences? Some nodding. Okay. So why the change? Which I think gets to address the point that the lady was making earlier. What's going on here? And we've got 3 slides that effectively take the data. This is the raw data, and then Sam has collapsed some of the categories to try and provide a shape, as it were. So main changes to the L&D team, as we've already said, things that are happening, and almost certainly in order to reflect changes as they are being observed within the business, is restructuring of personnel of the business itself. Then also movement towards centralisation of resources, some sharing, and a fair slice on increased efficiency, downsizing, or more business-like. Now the next slide, so that's the raw data. The next slide collapsed restructuring, centralisation, and sharing with other departments into one super category called restructuring. It was argued that centralisation, sharing with other departments and so on often involves some form of restructure. So collapse all this data together to give, I guess, a broader picture where, I guess, restructuring becomes more and more important. Any thoughts or observations on that? That seem to have a corollary with other people's experiences?
I was just going to say, improve e-efficiency?
We're getting ahead of ourselves. There we are. Well done, you. That's a future trend spotted. So we're basically, again, collapsing the data again. Effectively, what we end up with is restructuring of some form or another, and about 90%, and almost inconsequentially, some other stuff that happens once in a while. And I got my notes here. Only 2 companies said they were reducing their outsourcing. Now, from memory, I think it was the lady at the back who said that there was a tendency for more and more internalisation of resource and delivery. That seems, if I read this right, that seems to be going in the opposite direction. Not many people are pushing towards more internal resource and more internal use of L&D.
My company has just undertaken a massive 2-year review of our learning and development teams. Whilst using a centralised team, we've sort of decentralised as well to little pockets of other teams within the site of where we work. And we're retraining a lot of the workforce to actually move into positions which have been created with the output from the review. So we are actually trying to reduce our outsourcing by internalising a lot of things we do and retraining people who wouldn't really be put into those positions, thus creating more job opportunities within the business.
Okay. Does that echo anyone else's experiences or their approaches? Or alternatives? Anyone doing things in a very different way? So moving on to technology, as it were, the results seem to be suggesting that if we're trying to do more with less, with a relatively small team, maybe budgets are staying the same or they might be decreasing, the role of technology becomes ever more important. And it's seen as technology helps to improve productivity. And here are some of the quotations, as it were, from the respondents on the survey. Okay. So, with this being the case then, where is the confidence? What do people see as the main challenges, the main problems, and so on for the L&D team, and skill set? And the interesting thing is looking at something like, depending on the way we've collapsed the data, 90% of organisations saying L&D restructuring, almost certain, it's going to happen. 7 in 7, 4 in 6, whatever it might be. However, in terms of seeing as the problem, actually going through the process, only 25% of them see that as a problem, as an issue. With Chris's notes pointing me towards the idea that just maybe we've got so used to changing and so used to restructuring, it isn't seen as a challenge anymore. Any thoughts on that? Has change become the norm? The skill set then in there. The other thing that Chris has pointed out is that this section on the right-hand side, the 46%, is that there was no distinction made between e-learning versus self-serve. They were seen as one and the same, synonymous. Any thoughts on that? Are they the same? I didn't think so. I'm pushing this out into the room because you guys are the L&D experts. What do you think lies behind the way these two concepts are seen as exactly the same? And is there damage there? You were shaking your head. They're not the same.
Well, self-service means so much, and it's so different for different people. Self-service within an IT environment, it could be your own procurement, could be password resets, could be anything like that. Thank you. But e-learning is something completely different. So how was the question originally phrased? And probably why it's been grouped together is a lot of people see, oh, if I go onto the computer, go onto the internet, that is e-learning, and I'm self-serving my e-learning, possibly. But I see them as two completely different subjects.
So within my own narrow confines of my experience at the university, we'll often run webinars with global MBA students distributed all around the world. And it'll be sort of semi-blended. There'll be a webinar instructor, they'll have done some pre-work, they'll often completed some assessments or done some kind of reflective work. And they are online, but they're not entirely self-serve. Yes, they have to do some things themselves, but it's a classroom environment tried to be delivered in an e-learning context. Okay, we're moving on to the home stretch, as it were. So this section here is taken from the famous line, give a man a fish and he can sort of feed his family for a day, teach a man to fish and he could feed his family for life. I think the idea here is that with less people, less time, potentially less budgets, the move towards providing responsibility onto the individual for their own self-development seems to be key, and technology being one of the means of providing that medium, as it were, so people can take responsibility. So we ask ourselves, what is happening then? So 60% currently employ e-learning technologies, and it accounts for around about 20% of the budget. A lot of companies, about 33% increase in e-learning uptake over the last 2 years. And I think one of the challenges that I said earlier about outsourcers versus production internally of the materials, the e-learning materials, is that there might be a move to outsourcing, but does that necessarily mean that strategic aims are met? That the courses that are delivered, the e-learning modules or whatever they might be, are they delivering value? And again, some of the earlier slides were showing often a lack of evidence, certainly from this survey, that showed that there was value, or maybe a lack of strategic alignment. It says here at the bottom, but people didn't even see necessarily that access to learning was a perceived benefit for an employee. So then what are some of the issues that underlie this? And we've got some quotations here pointing towards some of the issues that came through from the respondents. So wariness, it says here, a lack of clarity as to what the benefits might be, which seems to be potentially a communication issue, how those benefits are communicated. Different kinds of settings, lack of management support and commitment. Well, it's often the case you'd see with any form of change initiative, no matter what it was, that without appropriate support, without the culture being supportive and providing the necessary resources, that change often gets stuck, as it were. Lots of different formats, lots of chopping and changing between different approaches, I guess leading to some levels of bewilderment, and therefore because of that lack of uptake, so the lack of communication, lack of tendency towards misunderstanding, and so on.
Did anybody say anything about the fact that they feel, the employee might feel shortchanged by being put on an e-learning rather than being put in a workshop or a classroom? Because that's certainly some of the things I get from where I work.
That's what I get, that's what we get at the university all the time, is a tendency to perceive, and I would say in many cases probably wrongly, but to perceive that as soon as it's being delivered in a non-face-to-face format, that it can't be as good. That you're somehow losing out in one way or another because it's no longer face-to-face delivery. And that's probably quite a key issue. Anyone else like to comment on that or any thoughts on that? Is e-learning seen as a cheap option, a poor relative?
It's always been like that, isn't it?
Okay. Born and lived 10
as far as you like.
It's
It's always been like that.
E-learning is always associated with cost cutting.
Yeah.
And we need to save costs, so therefore we're going to put it through e-learning in whatever format it's going to be. So the employee automatically assumes, well, if there's less money being spent on e-learning, the employer values me less, so therefore why should I be bothered? What's in it for me?
Gentleman over here.
I think there's something about what sort of things we put through e-learning as well, because some things people will naturally pull on. You know, for instance, if you're with a company that has some new and exciting technological products, the people out there, if you're talking about the sales force, probably really want to get to know that and know it quite quickly, so they'll be quite eager to go get it. But if you go try and put some things out for things where they feel that they already have a good level of knowledge, then they're not quite so interested. So there's something about the way that we put it out there and how attractive we make it in the first instance. And quite often a lot of the e-learning that I've seen out there just gets put out and it's not particularly interesting, it's not exciting, it's not creating an anticipation in readiness to get that kind of learning. So there's almost a lack of understanding, but it's also generated from ourselves in that we don't put enough focus and attention on that at the start.
Oh, there's two comments at the top of the room.
Stanley's walking up there. Often the issue is that to cut costs, you go to e-learning, and often it is chosen as an option because they have to sheep dip everybody, and as a consequence, often they choose a subject which is lending itself perfectly to e-learning, anti-money laundering or something awful like that. And as a consequence, the e-learning is boring, and as a consequence, e-learning gets baggage, and we go round in circles. Over to that.
I've just done a study of all our internal data looking at the evaluation, And what I was kind of hoping was that the results of the e-learning surveys would demonstrate that people may not perceive the value instantly, but then as they thought about how they're going away and applying it, they'd apply it sooner, so the learning would be much more relevant and more timely. Unfortunately, that wasn't what our data proved.
Right.
And the value was definitely not perceived anywhere near as high with any of our e-learning. And again, I think that's probably down to the subject matters. So I think a lot of our mandatory and statutory training is included in that data. And my next step is to exclude the mandatory and statutory to see if that makes a difference in what the data is actually telling us.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the point I was going to cover, that certainly in our organisation, a lot of the e-learning has been of mandatory and statutory nature, and the content's really bland, so it's not got a good reputation. I think the other thing we need to consider is people coming out of universities, or certainly the young generation. If we stuck them in a 3-day workshop as part of their induction, they'll switch off straight away. So we need to make their inductions really engaging, or they will be.
Anyone have any more positive? There's this gentleman here and this lady here.
I was going to reinforce that, and I think there's a wider cultural issue within organisations. Part of it is age-related, but it's also around if you just stop doing one method and move to another method, people will often look back fondly with the old method as it used to be. But after a period of time, self-sufficiency, people don't want to give that up. You know, and I think I remember the days when people used to bring tea and coffee around to your desk on a trolley, and then they moved to ghastly machines, and it was awful, and nobody liked it. Now people make their own arrangements or whatever; they can have precisely what they want. But it takes a while to adjust to that, and I wonder whether we're as good at helping that cultural adjustment to help make not just the technology work, but help the individuals know how to make best use of the technology, or how to make best use of conversations with their colleagues, or how to make best use of searching to find the right resources. And maybe we don't do enough of the teaching people to fish.
Yes, and I can imagine we'll see a strong change in people's comfort and regular use of a self-serve type model. You've mentioned some example of tea and coffee. When supermarkets first started, the idea there wasn't someone who would get something off the shelf for you was seen as completely crazy. But nowadays, the vast majority of the world has moved from a more sit-back situation, let things wash over, to a sit-forward. I want to look for it myself on YouTube. I want to search for it myself on Twitter. I want to find out for myself what people are doing on Facebook. Now, if that is starting to become the norm de rigueur in terms of people's activities, I wouldn't be surprised if in the long run that starts to slide into and influence how they look at on-the-job training and different kind of learning interventions as well. Now, the microphone's there, and afterwards there was the lady there waiting as well.
Sorry, just to go along with what some people have said already, while it is true that people see e-learning, they tend to see it as the cheap option, or that it's just in order to get some kind of money savings. There is at the same time a kind of a deeper change happening where when actually the perceived value of face-to-face lectures is also decreasing, and I even find for myself, my ability to, and this isn't directed towards you, but my ability to sit down and listen to a lecture just diminishes, by the day, and so it's almost sort of like, some kind of like when you move to another country, you don't realize that you've acclimated till you go back, and you notice all these things that have actually changed. I mean, and sorry, just to kind of go with that even further, the media theorist Neil Postman talks about this, that in the 19th century, when people had political debates, it was like an all-day sort of picnic event, at least in the United States, where people would listen to debates for hours upon hours. And now if people just don't get to the point, in a kind of any sort of quotable soundbite, then they're just simply not interested.
And I'm assuming there's a general trend. I mean, we certainly notice it with university students from undergraduates through to executive MBAs. I want to know it now. I want it in a bite-sized format. I don't need the references anymore. Just tell me exactly what I need to know as quickly as possible. So I guess that's a challenge that needs to be addressed in terms of meeting those consumers' needs. Any other comments? Any other thoughts?
Just a reflection of the same.
Sorry, before I'm sorry, we keep missing this lady. Been waiting very patiently. Just the lady there with the black top.
Sorry, just expanding on the gentleman out there. I think the same experience I teach in a corporate university, and I think the general dissatisfaction with structured learning, whether it's e-learning or whether it's attending classrooms versus all connected learning and social learning. But I had another question as well. There's an assertion in most of your slides that going to an external outsourced provider is not good. It's a worry. I just wanted to find out the background to why is it a worry if there is increased use of outsourced providers?
I'm not sure I necessarily read the same thing from the slides. What I read is that it can be a worry, and that there can be giving. If you hand over the design and delivery of key learning modules, and there isn't necessarily the skill within the L&D function to make sure that the things that are delivered are to strategic alignment, then you might have a problem. I wouldn't necessarily. I would hope there isn't an assumption that any form of external provision is dreadful. MBS has got a big executive education department, and we rely on working with externals in order to provide those. So I think that's very, very important. But I guess there's all sorts of pitfalls. I guess with anyone, you bring somebody from the outside in to do something that's important for you, whatever that might be. They could be brilliant. They could bring all sorts of expertise that you don't have and improve your service. But the problem is they might just not realise exactly what your problems and your issues are, and then the interventions they provide don't meet that, from it being from a plumber or a joiner through to someone in L&D. Now this lady, eventually.
In terms of how learners view the access to e-learning and whether it's a good thing or whether they see it as a benefit or not, a couple of ladies that were further back both mentioned the fact that people experience it as dull, and you mentioned about dull subjects being done as e-learning. But actually, I think that's part of the problem, that e-learning doesn't have to be dull, and it's not about it all being games-based and fancy graphics and all of that. It's about actually engaging people in the problems that they face at work and really challenging them about it. And I think if you present regulatory training as dull, that message says, this is the only investment we're going to make in you, and we can't be bothered to do it properly because we don't think it's important. And actually, if you made it really engaging and actually said, this is important to us that you do this properly, and we want you to be better, and we want to deliver better business this way, I don't think the fact that it's e-learning would make any difference at all.
So it's not the medium, it's the content.
Yes.
So the fact that maybe the issue is that far too often the content that is delivered through the e-learning medium is tedious and dull.
Only if you make it that way.
Sure.
I do regulatory training, but it's about keeping people safe during clinical research. Lots of people do it very much based on what the legislation says, and you have to know that it says this here and what you have to do. But actually, fundamentally, it's about interactions with people. And if that's what you make it about, it's engaging.
Sure. Anyone else to add to that?
I think there's also a point around how you position a lot of these things like e-learning. So it's not a battle always of it's either e-learning or it's a classroom experience. And what we've spent a lot of time doing is to be able to coherently talk about an associate development plan or a person's development plan. And some of that might be e-learning delivered, some of it will be classroom delivered. But all of it is a path towards what they finally want to accomplish with their development. And in some cases, the e-learning can act as a very good prerequisite or a bit of pre-work into a classroom event. So it's a very coherent story then as to how this helps them with their overall development. And I think then it gets away a little bit from the, I'm not going on a classroom, I'm just going on an e-learning.
I think it's about being nuanced. If we look at different forms of learning styles, you take Cole, for example, people learn in different ways. There seems to be almost a natural assumption, I mean, we propagate this ourselves, that classroom-based learning or face-to-face based learning is better. Well, different people have different learning needs. They learn at different rates, or they want to learn in a different order. And at least if you're providing that as an option in terms of modules that you can use from an e-learning context, there might actually be a lot more autonomy. And if we look at some of the generational changes that we're seeing, increasingly the main drivers for what people want is autonomy, freedom, independence, choice. Actually, e-learning could be an amazing medium, providing the content is good, for delivering against those objectives. I'm conscious of time.
We've just got a couple of minutes.
Good. So, Chris has left me with some key questions. This is the last slide, pleased to hear, in terms of our key kinds of questions. So I'm hoping we've actually addressed quite a lot of these already. So the first one, are we saving money at the expense of impact and development of new capabilities? You guys know a lot more about this than I do. What are your thoughts on that question?
No.
Could I probe you a little, push you a little bit more for some depth in response? Why not?
I think implicit in the question is the idea that there's a direct correlation between if you spend this much, you get that amount of development. I think it's about getting smarter. I think it's, you can save money and still do better learning.
Sure.
If you're smart. Of course, it might well be that, in some places it is just about cost cutting, and there is a loss of the ability to affect capabilities. But I'm hoping we're in a world now, as technology moves on, or understanding of learning moves on, that we should be able to deliver more for less.
We'll move on to the second question, given our 5 minutes. With culture change and new capabilities being critical for business success, is outsourcing design and content reducing organisations' ability to create a differentiated competitive product? So lack of differentiation as we outsource and get more off the shelf, is what I read there. What do we think?
It depends massively on how we do it. So if I think about how I work with outsourcers, I would partner with them very closely to ensure that they understand the organisation, they understand the nuances of how we operate, and they tailor the product to deliver the outcomes we need. There was a slide earlier on where it talked about, do L&D professionals have the skills and capabilities to understand whether they're driving value from outsourcers?
Yeah, or evaluating the quality.
That's no different to me designing an internal program.
Sure.
I go through the same process to partner with the outsource provider to check that they can demonstrate the kind of evidence that I would be looking for if one of my team was to deliver the program. So for me, I guess I struggle with the question a little bit. I think it's not in whether you outsource or whether you keep it in-house. In-house, it's doing the right thing for the right need and partner with the outsourcer in the right way to get the result you want. So I guess I struggle with the question overall.
Good, thank you. And it's good to disagree with the questions as well. So can technology-based learning ever successfully replace coaching, on-the-job development, face-to-face experiential practice and the delivery of changes to capability and culture? Can technology-based learning replace the stuff we normally or used to do?
Replaced it, it just supports it.
Yes. Just augment it. Again, back to saying about learning styles, people have different approaches. They want to learn and develop in different ways. And there's got to be a lot more flexibility involved in e-learning than having to wait for the right module with the right trainer in the right room at the right time and being able to get on a course. So much more freedom and autonomy. But as we keep going intact, if the content is dull, it's not going to achieve very much, I guess, or not as much as it might do. Are L&D functions disempowering themselves without empowering others to take on critically important roles? I have not a clue the answer to that. I don't know. Are L&D functions disempowering themselves without empowering others? So are they, I guess they're increasingly outsourcing things, increasingly handing over responsibility for design, delivery, and so on. Are they, or that they're increasingly needing to evaluate and monitor things, quality assurance and so on. Are they able to do that effectively?
It depends.
I didn't write it. I got my excuses in earlier. As I said, I didn't write it. I don't know. It's supposed to be food for thought, I think, more than anything else. Are we not happy with this question? Anyone would like to have a stab at it? Well, scratch. What question would you like to have been at the bottom? That's put you on the spot, isn't it?
I can't think of anything clever and funny to say.
Can anyone else think? I can't either. Anyone else think of anything funny or clever to say as a final question or to wrap up what we've been talking about?
Are L&D functions critically important to the business? I believe they are.
I think that's if I'm being honest, it's almost a silly question. They have to be, surely. They're absolutely vital. Annie?
Has anyone succeeded in their own space? Has anyone cracked it?
Ooh.
Anybody in the audience have you said, you know what, we're about there, 85 to 100%, we're happy, got the plan?
I don't think as an L&D professional I'm ever happy. I always want to improve what I've done.
What about 85% happy? Well, you didn't say
65. I mean, just succeeding as opposed to we aren't there yet.
All right, that's a simple question. Put your hands up if you're an L&D provider who thinks you're 85% of the way there in terms of success.
You can succeed with an individual product.
Okay.
I mean, with L&D, you quite often get given a task to complete. A new office program comes in, a new piece of equipment, something like that, and you've got to train X amount of workforce. You're given 18 months, 18 weeks, sometimes 3 months. If you get it done in that time, you've completed that project. But by its very nature, the day you finish that one, there'll be 3 more than on your desk.
Sure, and I guess deep down, we've already covered this ground, so I think it seems an opportune moment to bring it up again. What becomes the metric for success? How do we determine, how do we have this quality assurance process that says this was successful or not? Not an easy thing.
Just a reflection, because I'm not a corporate learning and development professional. I'm kind of a consumer looking for a response. But I guess what I'm getting is that nobody has really defined success.
Well, I think there's an issue like that, because if you don't know what success is, how do you know whether you've achieved it, and how do you know you've got the right metrics?
Yeah.
That's a constant challenge.
I think your point was right. You answer it in the strategic space, because once you define success, then operationally you can pull in and say, within that context, it's okay.
But there's also, I think, the continuing pace of change. For me, it feels like chasing the horizon. You know, I see it there. By the time I've got there, suddenly the horizon's moved on. And so you're always, if you're not careful, evaluating your success against where you think you should be. And people are not interested in the metrics of like where you should have been a year ago. They're not interested in right now. So it's something about perception.
So with that, I think we've taken up our time, and I threw myself upon your mercy at the very beginning. And
can I just make one point? Because I think we might be getting a little closer to helping just in terms of how we're positioning. So I work for Mars, and we've spent a lot of time and energy putting together a corporate university, and we've made significant strides, I think, in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of recontracting with the business, understanding what the business vision is for the next 8 to 12 years, how we're going to align and support that. And within that, we've spent a lot of time saying what's important to the business. And it's key measures like our talent pipeline. So if we're not developing the right people to be able to fill the critical roles within our business, we're not doing our job as an L&D department. So it's all around the succession planning, it's developing great leaders, it's the talent pipeline that we're putting together. And talking in that language and being able to measure it in terms of how many great people we're bringing through allows us to be really sitting at the table and talking to them about the contribution we're making to the business. And we've done that through the development of capability frameworks to support all of the critical roles, learning that's aligned to that capability development, etc.
And with that positive note, I am going to call an end to the time, because I know most of you are already thinking about home or the drinks reception that's going on downstairs that you're already missing out on. So I'll be very, very brief. First of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation. I threw myself upon your mercy at the very beginning. I said I got the slides about 6 days ago. They're not mine, didn't design the research and so on. And I really was relying on you to make this work, as it were, to ask questions and to answer them yourselves. Didn't even need me up here at all. You just had automatically someone pushing the button. So thank you all very much for that. I hope you found the results intriguing. Maybe we disagreed with some of them. Maybe we need to delve deeper. And I'm sure that Chris, if you were here, would be able to answer the questions far better than I have. So I have to apologise to him for the massacre I've made of his presentation. And with that, I wouldn't possibly want to comment. So rather than you clapping me, I'd actually like to clap you. Thank you very much for all of your help.
Mark Beatty, ladies and gentlemen.